432 children. That was the figure given to the House of Commons on the 29th of November, 1972. 432 British children, born with injuries caused by a sleeping pill their mothers had been told was safe. There was an offer on the table. It came with a condition. The money would only be paid if every single family agreed to take it. One refusal, and nobody received anything. That condition was not a rumor. It was the shape of the deal, and it held for years, and it worked exactly as it was designed to work. Families who wanted to fight were pushed to settle by families who could not afford to wait. In London, an art dealer named David Mason read the terms and calculated what a lifetime of care for his daughter would actually cost. Then he refused to sign. What came back at him was not an argument from the company. It was pressure from the other parents, and then a legal move to strip him of the authority to make decisions for his own child. 10 years earlier, the same drug had been advertised in the British medical press. The wording was read aloud in Parliament that afternoon. Distaval, the advertisement said, can be given with complete safety to pregnant women. No test had ever been done to support that sentence. 2 doctors had identified the danger, working independently on opposite sides of the world. Their findings were correct. The manufacturer disputed them for as long as it could. In Washington, a reviewer at the American Drug Agency refused to approve the same compound for 14 months and was called obstructive for it. None of that is contested now. All of it was established decades ago, in documents that still exist. In Germany, 9 men from the company that made the drug were put on trial. The case ran for 2.5 years, 283 days of hearings. It ended without a verdict, not an acquittal, not a conviction. It simply stopped. And in Britain, when a newspaper assembled the same evidence independently and prepared to print it, a court ordered the newspaper not to publish. So the record exists. It was gathered twice, by a criminal court and by a national newspaper, and twice the public was kept from reading it. This is the account of how a fully documented harm crossed the second half of a century without a single finding of responsibility ever attaching to it. If you want more investigations built from the documents themselves, subscribing helps these get made. Chapter 1. The Soap Works at Stolberg. The company began with soap. In 1946, in the town of Stolberg near Aachen, a man named Hermann Wirtz set up a chemical business in the buildings of a former smelting works. West Germany was rubble and ration cards. Anything that could be manufactured could be sold. Wirtz had been a member of the Nazi Party. So had a great many German industrialists who kept working after the war ended. The occupying authorities had neither the capacity nor, after a point, the appetite to remove them all. Businesses restarted. Payrolls were rebuilt from whoever was available. The company took the name Chemie Grünenthal. Its first real product was not soap, it was penicillin. Penicillin in post-war Germany was worth more than currency. The Allies controlled its distribution. A German firm that could produce it domestically had a guaranteed market, and Grünenthal moved into that space quickly and profitably. To do that, it needed research staff. In 1946, the company hired a man named Heinrich Mückter as its head of research. Mückter's wartime record is documented. He had served as a deputy director of an institute in occupied Krakow devoted to typhus and virus research. Work of that kind, in that place, in those years, was not confined to laboratory animals. Historians of the institute have recorded human experimentation connected to it. Mückter was never charged with anything relating to that period, nor did he ever answer in court for what came later. He died in 1987, having faced no verdict on any count. That is a matter of record, and it is worth stating plainly because it is also the first small example of the pattern this story keeps returning to. Evidence accumulates. Nobody is ever required to answer for it in front of a judge. What can be established about Muchter at Grunenthal is this. He ran the research division. He held authority over what the company tested and what it published, and his pay was linked to what the company sold. That last detail matters more than it first appears. A research chief who earns more when the product moves is a research chief with a reason not to look too hard at a problem. The company around him was small, family-controlled, and ambitious. It was not one of the great German chemical houses. It had no century of prestige behind it. What it had was a laboratory, a sales force, and an urgent need for a product that could carry the whole business. In 1954, it found one. Chapter 2. A sedative that could not kill you. The compound was not new, and Grunenthal did not discover it. A Swiss firm had worked on a similar molecule earlier in the decade and abandoned it, having found no useful effect in animals. Grunenthal picked the chemistry up and pushed it forward. In its own laboratories, the compound was given a code, then a name: thalidomide. The animal work produced a result that seemed almost too convenient. The researchers could not find a dose that killed the test animals. They pushed the quantities up, and the animals kept surviving. To a company looking for a commercial sedative, this was the entire business case. Barbiturates were the standard of the day, and barbiturates killed people. They killed by accident, when a patient took one too many after a drink. They killed on purpose, when someone reached for the bottle in the worst hour of their life. Every doctor writing a prescription for a sleeping drug carried that risk in the back of the mind. A sedative with no apparent lethal dose was not just a better product. It was a different category of product. It could be sold without fear. It could be handed out freely. It could be recommended for nerves, for tension, for restlessness, for the ordinary sleeplessness of ordinary people. So the company built its marketing on exactly that claim. Thalidomide was promoted as harmless, as a drug so gentle it could be given to anyone. Here is what the animal data actually showed, and here is the gap. The tests measured whether the compound killed the animal that swallowed it. They did not measure what the compound did to an animal's offspring, because in 1954, almost nobody was measuring that. The prevailing belief among doctors and pharmacologists was that the placenta acted as a barrier. Whatever the mother took, the developing child was thought to be largely shielded from. That belief was wrong. It had never been properly tested. It was simply the assumption everyone worked from. So a claim about safety was built on a set of experiments that had not asked the question, and the claim was then repeated as though the question had been asked and answered. That is not a conspiracy. In 1954, it was closer to ordinary practice. What makes it a matter of responsibility is what the company did with the claim afterward, and how far it was willing to extend it. Chapter 3. The first case, disputed. Almost every account of thalidomide includes the same opening scene. A child born on Christmas Day, 1956, in West Germany, without ears. The father, it is said, worked for Grunenthal and had brought home samples of the company's new sedative for his pregnant wife. The story is repeated because it is unbearable and neat at the same time. The first victim, produced inside the company's own workforce, months before the drug went on public sale. This account is going to handle it differently, because the way that story is usually told is not the way the evidence supports. Begin with what is reasonably well established. Grunenthal did distribute samples before the official launch. An employee obtaining some for his own household is entirely plausible and consistent with how the company operated. A child was born at the end of 1956 with the absence of external ears, now the part that is weaker than its fame. The identification of that birth as the first thalidomide case was made in retrospect, years later, once the pattern was understood and people began searching backward through history for early examples. Nobody at the time recorded it as a drug injury, because nobody at the time had any reason to. Absence of external ears occurs for other reasons. It occurred before thalidomide existed, and it occurs now. A single case, unexamined at the time, cannot be assigned to a cause with confidence on the strength of a plausible exposure and a matching feature. The honest position is this: it may well have been the first. It cannot be shown to have been the first, and it is treated as certain mainly because it makes a very good opening line. That distinction is not pedantry, and it is not a defense of the company. It matters for a specific reason, connected to everything else in this story. A record that overstates itself is easier to attack. When the defense at Alsdorf set about undermining the case, its most effective work was done on exactly this kind of material, claims that had hardened into fact through repetition rather than evidence. Every one of those that could be knocked down made the solid material look less solid by association. The case against Grunenthal did not need the Christmas Day story. It rested on documents the company had written itself, correspondence it had answered, advertising it had commissioned, sales instructions it had issued. Those things are provable, dated, and in the company's own hand. The strongest way to tell this history is to leave out the parts that cannot be proved, and to state plainly where the record stops. There is more than enough left. Chapter 4. The 1st of October. Grunenthal put the drug on the West German market on the 1st of October, 1957. The trade name was Contergan. It did not require a prescription. A person could walk into a pharmacy and buy it the way they might buy aspirin. That was legal, and it was central to the plan. Before the launch, and for a long time after it, the company distributed free samples to doctors on a large scale. This was standard promotional practice, and Grunenthal used it aggressively. Sample packets moved through medical offices in enormous numbers. Samples leave no prescription record. There is no pharmacy log, no dispensing note, no chain of paperwork tying a particular tablet to a particular patient. When investigators later tried to establish who had taken the drug and when, that absence became a permanent hole in the evidence. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. A promotional method chosen for commercial reasons had the side effect of making the eventual harm harder to trace. Nobody planned that. It happened anyway, and the families paid for it. Sales were enormous. Within a few years, Contergan was among the best-selling pharmaceutical products in West Germany. The company's advertising described it as safe, as suitable for children, as appropriate for pregnant women and nursing mothers. That last extension is the one that ended everything. There was no clinical trial in pregnancy. There was no study of what the compound did to a developing embryo. The company had no data pointing either way, because no data had been generated. In the absence of evidence, the marketing filled the space with reassurance. And the timing of the harm was cruelly precise. The damage thalidomide caused occurred in a narrow window of early pregnancy, roughly between the 20th and the 36th day after conception. That is often before a woman knows for certain that she is pregnant. It is also exactly when morning sickness begins. A drug marketed as a gentle remedy for nausea and sleeplessness was therefore most likely to be taken in the precise days when it could do the most harm. The commercial logic and the biological damage lined up perfectly, by accident. Chapter 5. The Men with the Sample Cases. A pharmaceutical company in 1958 did not sell to patients. It sold to doctors, and it sold to them in person. The instrument was the medical representative, a man with a car, a territory, and a case full of sample packets, calling on general practitioners in their surgeries between appointments. Grünenthal built one of the more energetic operations of its kind in West Germany. The company's product was easy to explain and easy to like. It did not require the doctor to learn anything complicated. It came with a story that fitted into 90 seconds. Here is a sedative. It works. It cannot kill your patient, even if they take the whole bottle. Try it. The representative left samples behind. The doctor, having something free in a drawer, gave it to the next patient, who mentioned trouble sleeping. If it worked, the doctor wrote it down as a good drug and recommended it again. That loop is the entire mechanism by which thalidomide reached the scale it reached. It was not primarily an advertising success. It was a distribution success, built on personal contact and free product. Two consequences followed from it, and neither was intended. The first is the paper trail, or rather the absence of one. A prescription generates a record in a pharmacy. A sample handed across a desk generates nothing. Millions of doses moved through the system, leaving no documentary trace of who received them. The second is subtler and more damaging. A representative is not a scientist. When reports of nerve damage began circulating, the men in the field were the ones fielding questions from worried doctors, and their job was to keep the doctor comfortable. They were supplied with reassuring answers, because reassurance was the product they were trained to deliver. That is not a conspiracy to deceive. It is the ordinary operation of a sales force. But the effect was that the company's most frequent contact with the medical profession, at exactly the moment doubts were forming, was a channel designed to dissolve doubt. The information that would have mattered flowed upward into files. The information that flowed outward, to the doctors actually writing prescriptions, was confidence. By 1960, that confidence had made Contergan one of the largest selling medicines in the country. The company had built something that worked beautifully, and had built into it a mechanism for not hearing bad news. Chapter 6. The Advertisement. In Britain, the drug arrived under a different name and a different company. The Distillers Company, known to most of the public for whiskey, ran a pharmaceutical arm called Distillers Company Biochemicals. It licensed thalidomide from Grünenthal and brought it to the British market in 1958, under the trade name Distaval. British doctors read the medical journals. Distillers advertised in them. One of those advertisements was read into the parliamentary record in 1972, more than a decade after the drug had been withdrawn. The words were these: Distaval can be given with complete safety to pregnant women and nursing mothers without adverse effect on mother or child. Complete safety, not probable safety. Not safety in the doses studied, complete. The most widely remembered version of the Distaval advertising showed a small child at a medicine cabinet, reaching upward toward the shelf. The message was that this was a household where a bottle within a toddler's reach was not a danger. The image was the whole argument in one picture. A drug so safe that the worst domestic accident a parent could imagine simply would not matter. Behind that sentence about pregnant women, there was nothing. No trial, no animal reproduction study, no published data on placental transfer of this compound. The claim was an inference drawn from the general assumption of the period, and then printed as a specific promise. A doctor reading that page had no realistic way to know the difference. Advertisements in medical journals carried an implication of substantiation. The reader assumed that a manufacturer stating a fact in print had grounds for it. There is a distinction here that the later legal fight turned on, and it should be set out now rather than saved. Selling a drug that turns out to be dangerous is one thing. Every medicine carries unknown risk, and history is full of remedies later found to be harmful. That alone is misfortune, not fault. Printing a specific safety guarantee for a specific population, when no work has been done on that population, is something else. That is a claim the company chose to make. Nobody required it. Nobody was misled into it. It was a marketing decision, and it is the sentence that put the drug into the hands of the exact group of people it would injure. Chapter 7. The barrier that was not there. The defense that eventually protected everyone in this story rested on a single scientific belief, and that belief deserves to be examined rather than accepted. The belief was that the placenta functions as a barrier, that the developing child sits behind a filter which excludes what the mother takes in. It was widely held. It was taught. It shaped what nobody bothered to test. It was also, by 1954, already known to be wrong. In 1941, an ophthalmologist in Sydney named Norman Gregg published a paper with a plain title, Congenital Cataract, Following German Measles in the Mother. Gregg had noticed an unusual cluster of babies born with cataracts. He asked the mothers what had happened during their pregnancies and found that an outbreak of rubella had passed through the population at the relevant time. He proposed that an infection in the mother had injured the developing eye. The proposal was resisted at first and then confirmed. It became one of the foundational findings of the field, and it established something with no ambiguity in it. Something in the mother's body could reach the developing child and damage it in a specific, predictable, timing-dependent way. Once that is known, the barrier model is finished as a general rule. The question is no longer whether the developing child can be reached from outside. It is what else can reach it. 13 years separated Gregg's paper from the beginning of thalidomide's development. The finding was not obscure. It was in the literature, discussed, and increasingly accepted. Now hold that next to the defense argument. The argument was that nobody in the 1950s tested drugs for effects on the unborn, because everybody believed the placenta protected them. The first half of that sentence is accurate. Testing of that kind was genuinely rare, and it did not become routine until after thalidomide forced it. The second half is where the argument weakens. The belief was not intact. It had a hole in it that a Sydney eye doctor had put there before the war ended, and the profession knew about the hole. This does not make anyone at Grunenthal a criminal. Practice lags behind knowledge in every field, and a company following the ordinary standard of its industry is doing what almost every company does. It does dispose of one specific claim. It was not impossible to imagine that a substance taken by a pregnant woman could injure her child. The scientific world already had a documented example. What was missing was not the idea. What was missing was anyone with a commercial reason to go looking, and one company had gone considerably further than failing to look. It had printed a promise. Chapter 8. 46 countries thalidomide did not stay in Germany. Grunenthal licensed it outward, and by the early 1960s the compound was on sale in around 46 countries under dozens of different brand names. Distaval in Britain, Contergan in West Germany, Sofenon, Neurocedin, Talimol, Kevidon, and many more elsewhere. That proliferation of names is not a small detail. It is one of the reasons the pattern took so long to see. A doctor in Sweden noticing something strange, and a doctor in Australia noticing something strange, were not looking at the same word on a label. They had no reason to connect their observations, because nothing in front of either of them said these were the same molecule. The regulatory landscape of the era made this worse, in a way that is difficult to convey now. There was, in most countries, no requirement that a manufacturer prove a drug worked before selling it. There was often no requirement to prove it was safe in any systematic sense. In the United States, a manufacturer had to notify the authorities and could proceed if no objection was raised within a set period. In much of Europe, the bar was lower still. There was no international system for reporting adverse effects. If a doctor in one country identified a problem, there was no mechanism that would carry that information to a doctor in another. The medical journals were the closest thing to a network, and the journals moved at the pace of print. So a drug could be in 46 countries and effectively invisible as a single object. The harm it caused was distributed across dozens of health systems, in dozens of languages, under dozens of names, with nobody positioned to add it up. That absence of a system is not a villain, it is a condition. But it is the condition that allowed 4 years of injury to accumulate before anyone assembled the picture. And when someone finally did assemble it, the difficulty was no longer scientific. It was that the picture pointed at a profitable product owned by a company that did not want to hear it. Chapter 9. What was in the cupboard? It is easy to describe this story from the height of company records and national statistics. The people inside it were not living at that height. Consider what the drug actually was in a household. It was a small tablet. It cost very little. In Germany, for 4 years, it could be bought without seeing a doctor at all. A woman in the first weeks of a pregnancy, sick every morning, exhausted, told by advertising and often by her own physician that this particular remedy was gentle and safe, took one. Perhaps she took several over a few days. Perhaps she took one and never thought about it again. There was no reason to write it down. Nobody keeps a record of a mild tablet taken for nausea. That is why so many of the later cases were so hard to prove. Mothers could not always say with certainty what they had taken, or when, or how much. Some had been given samples by a doctor with no note made. Some had taken a tablet from a relative's supply. The families were asked, years afterward, to reconstruct with legal precision a decision they had made in 30 seconds while feeling unwell. And they were asked to do it while raising children who needed constant care, often without support, frequently without any clear medical explanation of what had happened or why. The injuries themselves varied enormously, depending on the exact day of exposure. Some children were affected in the arms, some in the legs, some in the internal organs, some in hearing or sight. Some were affected in several ways at once. Around 4 in 10 did not survive their first year. The narration will not linger on the physical detail. It does not need to. The point that matters here is a different one, and it is the point the record keeps making. These were not abstract casualties. They were specific children, in specific houses, in specific towns, whose parents had followed medical advice exactly. That is the group that would spend the next decade being told that proving what had happened to them was their own responsibility. Chapter 10. The words people used language matters in this history in a way that is not decorative, and it is worth stopping to set the terms out. The clinical word most associated with thalidomide is phocomelia. It describes a pattern in which the long bones of a limb are shortened or absent, so that a hand or a foot sits close to the trunk. The word was in the medical literature long before this drug existed, because the condition existed long before this drug existed, rarely. Doctors in the early 1960s reached for it because it was the closest available term. It was not a perfect fit. Thalidomide produced a wide spectrum of injury, including damage to hearing, sight, the heart, the kidneys, and the digestive system, and a great many affected children had no limb involvement at all. That imprecision had consequences that were not academic. A compensation system organized around a visible limb pattern will recognize some injured people immediately and struggle to recognize others. Children with internal or sensory damage, whose bodies did not match the picture in the public mind, had a harder path to being counted. The general term used in Germany at the time translates roughly as malformations. In Britain, the press and the courts spoke of deformed children, and Parliament used that language too, as the record of the 1972 debate shows. This account will not use those words in its own voice, for two reasons. The first is accuracy. The modern term is thalidomide, embryopathy, meaning injury to an embryo caused by thalidomide. It is more precise, and precision is the point of this exercise. The second is that the older vocabulary carried an implication the evidence does not support. To call a person deformed is to describe them as a departure from a correct version of themselves. What actually happened is that a chemical interrupted a specific developmental process on a specific set of days, and everything that followed was a body developing normally around that interruption. The distinction runs through the survivors' own accounts of their lives. Many of them have spent decades correcting the assumption that their injury is the most important fact about them. There is one more piece of terminology to fix, because the whole legal story turns on it. Teratogen. It means an agent that causes injury to a developing embryo. The word existed before 1961. What did not exist was a routine expectation that new medicines be tested against it. Thalidomide is the reason that expectation now exists. It is, in the most literal sense, the case that created the category, as a practical matter, of regulation rather than a term in an academic paper, which is worth holding on to through everything that follows. The thing that made this drug uniquely destructive was not that it was unusually poisonous. It was that it arrived at the exact moment when nobody was required to ask the one question that would have caught it. Chapter 11. Pins and Needles. The first documented trouble with thalidomide had nothing to do with pregnancy. From 1959 onward, reports began reaching Grunenthal from doctors describing a particular pattern in adult patients who had taken the drug over an extended period. Numbness in the hands and feet, tingling, burning sensations, a coldness in the extremities that did not resolve. The clinical term is peripheral neuritis, and it describes damage to the nerves furthest from the spine. In its milder forms, it is uncomfortable. In its severe forms, it is disabling, and in some patients, the damage proved permanent even after the drug was stopped. A German neurologist named Ralph Voss was among those who raised the issue directly. He had seen it in his own patients, and he connected it to the tablets they were taking. The company's response is the part of the record that matters. The company did not conceal the reports entirely. In 1960, it revised the German package insert. That is an action, and it should be counted as one. But a revised insert is a small instrument. It changes a leaflet inside a box. It does not stop a product being sold across the counter to people who will never read the insert closely, and it does not reach the doctor who has already formed a habit of recommending the drug. Meanwhile, the sales force continued to sell. Company representatives visiting doctors were in the business of reassurance, and reassurance is what they provided. Here is the significance of the nerve damage reports, and it is easy to miss. Peripheral neuritis proved that thalidomide was not inert. It proved the compound was biologically active in the human body in ways the animal work had not predicted. The central marketing claim that this was a substance so gentle it could not really do anything bad had a hole in it by 1959. The company knew the drug could injure nerve tissue in adults. That knowledge sat in its files while the advertising continued to describe the product as suitable for pregnant women. Nobody at Grünenthal in 1959 was thinking about embryos. That has to be said fairly, because the temptation in a story like this is to read backward and assume everyone knew everything. They did not know. What they had was the first clear evidence that their own safety claim was too broad and a commercial interest in not examining it further. Chapter 12. The Correspondence Doctors, Right to Manufacturers. It is one of the least dramatic activities in medicine, and it produced, in this case, the most important body of evidence in the entire file. From 1959 onward, letters arrived at Grünenthal describing patients with numbness, tingling, burning in the hands and feet. Some were brief notes. Some were detailed clinical descriptions from specialists who had ruled out other causes. The company answered them. That is the crucial fact, and it is the reason this correspondence became central to the criminal case. A letter that is ignored proves only that somebody did not open the post. A letter that receives a considered reply proves the recipient read it, understood it, and formed a position. The replies did not deny that patients were experiencing symptoms. They questioned whether the drug was the cause. They pointed to other explanations. They noted that the number of reports was small relative to the number of doses sold, which was true, and which is also what you would expect early in the emergence of any adverse effect. Alongside the correspondence sat the internal material. Discussion of how to handle the reports, consideration of what to put in the package insert, guidance to the sales force about what to say when a doctor raised the subject. Prosecutors later assembled this material into a sequence, and a sequence is a different thing from a pile of documents. Read in order. It shows an organization that received information, evaluated it, decided it was not sufficient to change the product's position in the market, and equipped its representatives to say so. Read the same documents another way, and it shows an organization doing what any manufacturer does when early reports of a side effect arrive. Nobody withdraws a leading product on 4 letters. Companies investigate, wait for more data, revise the labeling, and continue. Both readings sit in the same archive. This account will not pretend the documents resolve themselves. What the documents do establish, beyond argument, is the timing. By 1960, the company knew its product could damage nerve tissue in adults, well enough to change the leaflet. That is not disputed by anyone, including Grünenthal. And the advertising for pregnant women continued after that date. That specific combination, a known capacity to injure, and an unaltered promise of complete safety for the most vulnerable patients, is the narrowest and strongest version of the case against the company. It is narrow because it does not require anyone to have foreseen the injuries to newborns. It only requires them to have noticed that their guarantee had stopped being true. Chapter 13. The Injury Nobody Counted. There is a second group of people in this story, and they are almost entirely absent from the way it gets told. The nerve damage described earlier did not stop when the drug was withdrawn. Peripheral neuritis caused by thalidomide could be permanent. Adults who had taken the tablets for months, for sleep or for nerves, or for the ordinary complaints of ordinary life, were left with numbness, pain, weakness, and unsteadiness that did not resolve. These were not children injured before birth. They were the drug's other casualties, and there were a great many of them. Estimates of how many adults were affected have never been established with confidence, and the reasons are by now familiar. 4 years of counter-sales in Germany. Sample packets moving through surgeries everywhere else. Nerve symptoms in a middle-aged adult have many possible causes and are easy to attribute to something else. But there is a further reason this group vanished from the account, and it is not evidentiary. The injured children were the moral center of the story. They were the reason legislatures acted and newspapers campaigned and companies eventually paid. An adult with permanent numbness in the feet could not compete with that and did not try. The compensation arrangements reflected it. The German foundation established after the settlement was directed at the children. The British trust was for the children. When the word victim was used in public discussion, it referred to the children. That prioritization was not unreasonable. A child with lifelong care needs is in a different category of harm from an adult with a chronic neurological complaint, and finite money has to go somewhere. The result, though, is a documented gap in the record. A drug injured 2 distinct populations. One was counted, argued over, litigated, and eventually supported. The other was noticed first, in 1959, and then quietly dropped from the story. And there is an uncomfortable irony sitting inside that. The adults were the early warning. Their symptoms were the first hard evidence that the compound was not the harmless substance the advertising described. Every argument about what the company should have known depends on the reports those patients generated. They supplied the evidence that mattered most, and they were not among the people it was eventually used to help. Chapter 14. Is Thalidomide to blame? On the last day of 1960, a short letter appeared in the British Medical Journal. It was written by a Scottish doctor named Leslie Florence. The heading was a question: Is thalidomide to blame? Florence described 4 patients of his own who had developed the same pattern of numbness and tingling. He set out what he had seen, noted the common factor, and asked whether other doctors had observed anything similar. That is all it was. A few paragraphs in the correspondence pages of a weekly journal, published on the 31st of December, when much of the profession was on holiday. It is worth understanding what a letters column meant in 1960, because it is not what it means now. There was no adverse event database. There was no regulator collecting reports and looking for patterns. The correspondence section of a major medical journal was, in practical terms, the reporting system. A doctor with a suspicion wrote in, and other doctors either recognized the pattern or did not. It worked, in the sense that it was better than nothing. It was slow, voluntary, and entirely dependent on whether the right reader happened to open the right issue. Florence's letter did produce responses. Other doctors wrote in describing similar cases. The evidence on nerve damage accumulated through 1961 in exactly this manner, one correspondent at a time. And this is the point at which the record becomes uncomfortable for the manufacturers, rather than merely unlucky. By 1961, thalidomide's capacity to cause lasting nerve injury was not a secret held inside a company. It was in the open literature of British medicine. Distillers knew. Grunenthal knew. The advertisement promising complete safety to pregnant women continued to run. There is no evidence that anyone connected nerve damage in adults to injuries in newborns at this stage. The two things looked entirely separate, and to a doctor in 1961, there was no obvious reason to link them. But a company that has learned its product damages nerves in grown adults and continues to guarantee its safety for an unborn child has made a choice about how much it wants to know. Chapter 15. The Prescription Line. Through 1961, the ground shifted underneath the drug in Germany, slowly and unevenly. In August of that year, thalidomide began moving to prescription-only status. This did not happen nationally in a single stroke. West Germany's pharmaceutical regulation ran through its individual states and each state acted on its own timetable. Some states restricted it in the summer of 1961. Others took months longer. Bavaria, the last of them, did not bring the drug under prescription control until the 1st of January, 1962. By that date, the drug had already been withdrawn from sale entirely, for reasons nobody in August had imagined. The Bavarian restriction arrived as a formality attached to a product that no longer existed. That timeline is worth holding on to, because it shows what regulation actually looked like in the country where the drug originated. Not a single authority weighing evidence. A patchwork, moving at the speed of state administration. On the 16th of August, 1961, the news magazine Der Spiegel published a report on the side effects. That is a significant date. It means the problem had crossed out of the medical literature and into the general press 4 months before the drug was pulled. Ordinary readers in Germany could learn that a hugely popular over-the-counter tablet was under suspicion. Sales did fall. They did not collapse. A product that has spent 4 years being described as harmless carries a great deal of momentum, and a magazine article does not stop a habit. Inside Grünenthal, the reaction to press coverage was defensive. The company's position was that the nerve damage reports were being exaggerated, that the incidence was low, and that the drug remained safe when used appropriately. Every one of those positions was arguable in 1961. None of them was dishonest on its face. Companies defend their products, and a company that abandoned a medicine at the first complaint would not last long. What the company could not argue, and what the record shows it did not do, was commission the studies that would have settled the question. The information needed to move from suspicion to knowledge existed as an experiment nobody had run. It stayed that way until a doctor in Hamburg started counting births. Chapter 16. The Pediatrician. In Hamburg, Widukind Lenz was a pediatrician and a geneticist at the University of Hamburg. In 1961, he began seeing something that should not have been possible. Children were being born with limb reductions of a very particular kind. In the most recognizable pattern, the long bones of the arms were shortened or absent, so that the hands sat close to the shoulders. There were injuries to ears and eyes, to the heart, to the internal organs. This was not a new condition in the sense that it had never been described. Isolated cases had appeared in the medical literature before. What was new was the number, a condition that a specialist might expect to see once in a career was arriving in his clinic repeatedly, within months. Lenz did what an epidemiologist does. He started asking the mothers what they had taken. The interviews were difficult for the reasons already described. Women did not necessarily remember a single tablet swallowed months earlier for nausea. Some remembered clearly. Some remembered only after being asked several times, which raises an obvious objection about suggestion, and Lenz was aware of that objection. By the middle of November 1961, he had assembled enough cases to be confident of the pattern. On the 15th of November, he contacted Grünenthal directly. He told the company what he had found and what he believed it meant. 3 days later, he presented his findings to a meeting of pediatricians in Düsseldorf. He did not name the drug publicly at that meeting. He described the pattern, stated that he believed a specific medication was responsible, and said he had informed the manufacturer. The response from the company was not gratitude. Grünenthal's position was that Lenz's evidence was insufficient, that his method was unreliable, and that he was causing alarm without proof. In correspondence and in argument, the company challenged both his data and his judgment. That reaction is entirely predictable, and it is also the hinge of the entire case. The question that would occupy a criminal court 7 years later was whether the company's refusal was a reasonable scientific disagreement or a decision to protect a product. Both interpretations survive the documents. That is precisely why the case became so difficult to resolve. And while it was being argued, on the other side of the world, a second doctor had reached the same conclusion from a completely different direction. Chapter 17. How a Pattern is Proved. There is a version of this story in which a clever doctor has a flash of insight. That version is wrong, and the real method is more interesting. What Widukind Lenz did in the autumn of 1961 was arithmetic under pressure. He began with a count. How many children with this pattern of limb reduction had been born in his catchment area, and how many should have been expected? The expected number came from the older literature, where such cases appear as rarities. The observed number was not a rarity. An excess of that size has a cause. It does not have to be a drug. It could be an infection, as in Greg's rubella cases. It could be an environmental exposure, a contaminant in food or water, a change in diet, radiation. So the next step is elimination, and elimination requires asking the mothers a great many questions about a great many things. Lenz asked about illnesses, about food, about work, about household products, about medication. Only when the answers clustered around a single tablet did the drug become the leading candidate. Then came the harder test, geography. If a drug is responsible, the cases should follow the drug's distribution. Areas where it sold heavily should show more cases. Areas where it sold poorly should show fewer. Timing should track availability, with the first cases appearing roughly 9 months after the drug reached a market and stopping roughly 9 months after it left. That is a demanding prediction, and it is very difficult to satisfy by accident. Thalidomide satisfied it. The rise and fall of the cases in each country tracked the rise and fall of sales in that country, offset by the length of a pregnancy. When the drug was withdrawn, the birth stopped. In the sequence, the withdrawal dates predicted. This is why the scientific question closed as quickly as it did. Not because anyone ran a trial. You cannot run a trial that deliberately exposes pregnant women to a suspected teratogen. The proof came from the pattern, and the pattern was overwhelming. Lenz also did something less celebrated and, over the long run, more useful. He kept going. For decades afterward, he documented which day of exposure produced which injury. Damage to the ears clustered at one point in the developmental sequence. Damage to the arms at another. Legs later. Internal organs at their own moments. The result is a calendar of harm, precise to a few days, built from thousands of individual cases. That work is why the injuries can be dated backward from the body. It is also, in the end, the reason certain claims could be assessed at all, because a child's specific pattern of injury could be checked against the timing the mother described. The man whose method the company spent years attacking had built the only instrument capable of confirming who was telling the truth. Chapter 18. 12 Days. William McBride was an obstetrician in Sydney. In the second half of 1961, he had delivered babies with the same distinctive pattern of injuries, and he too had traced the common factor back to the tablets the mothers had been given. 2 doctors, in Hamburg and in Sydney, working independently, with no contact and no shared data, arrived at the same drug. That independence is the strongest single piece of evidence in the entire scientific story. 2 observers reaching the same answer by separate routes is not a coincidence that can be dismissed as suggestion or bias. What followed in Germany took 12 days. On the 15th of November, Lenz told the company. On the 26th of November, the newspaper Welt am Sonntag published a report on the suspected link. The story was out in the general press, in a mass circulation Sunday paper. On the 27th of November, 1961, Grunenthal withdrew the drug from the German market. Those 3 dates are worth setting side by side, because they answer a question that later became central. The company did not withdraw the drug when a doctor privately told it there was a problem. It withdrew the drug the day after a newspaper told the public there was a problem. The company's own account, then and since, is that it acted quickly once the suspicion was raised, and that a matter of days between the first warning and the withdrawal shows responsibility rather than the reverse. The counter-reading is that 11 days passed in which the company argued, and the 12th day was the one that followed publication. Both readings fit the calendar. A court would spend years trying to determine which one described what actually happened inside the company, and, as this account will show, it never issued a finding. Britain followed within days. Distillers withdrew Distaval in early December 1961. Other countries followed through the winter, at different speeds, according to how quickly the news reached them and how their systems responded. Canada was among the slowest. The drug remained available there into 1962. By then, in a federal office in Washington, an application to sell thalidomide in the United States had been sitting on a reviewer's desk for more than a year, unapproved. Chapter 19. The application that was never approved. The story of the American reviewer who refused to sign is the one part of this history that gets told regularly, and it is usually told as a straightforward rescue. The rescue is real. It is also incomplete, and the incomplete part is what belongs in this account. Frances Oldham Kelsey joined the Food and Drug Administration in 1960. Within about a month of her arrival, an application landed with her to license thalidomide for the American market under the brand name Kevadon. The applicant was a Cincinnati firm, the William S. Merrill Company, part of Richardson Merrill. Under the law of the time, this should have been routine. The agency had 60 days to object. If it did not object, the drug could be sold. Kelsey objected. Her stated grounds were specific. The clinical evidence supporting the safety claims was thin, consisting substantially of physician testimonials rather than controlled data. And she had read about the nerve damage reports in the British literature. She also raised a question that almost nobody was raising in 1960. She had worked earlier in her career on how drugs behave across the placenta. She was not willing to assume that a developing child was protected from whatever the mother took. That question is the reason the application never cleared. She did not reject it outright and end the matter. Under the procedure of the day, she found the application incomplete, which restarted the clock and required the company to supply more. Then she did it again and again. Over roughly 14 months, the application was returned repeatedly for insufficient evidence. The company pushed back hard. Representatives visited. They telephoned. They went over her head to her superiors and complained that she was obstructive, unreasonable, and costing them a selling season. She did not move. The application was still unapproved when the news from Germany arrived, and Merrill withdrew it in the spring of 1962. Now, the part that is usually left out. Thalidomide was never approved in the United States. It was in the United States anyway. Under the investigational provisions of the time, a manufacturer could distribute an unapproved drug to physicians for clinical investigation. The requirements attached to that were minimal. Merrill used the provision at scale. More than 2.5 million tablets went out to more than 1,000 American doctors. Those doctors gave the drug to somewhere close to 20,000 patients. Several hundred of them were pregnant. The doctors were not required to keep systematic records. Many did not. When the agency later tried to trace where the tablets had gone, large portions of the distribution could not be accounted for. 17 American children were identified as having been injured by thalidomide. That figure is the number confirmed. It is not necessarily the number that occurred, because the records to establish a complete count were never created. So the American story is genuinely one of a catastrophe prevented. One reviewer's insistence on evidence spared that country the scale of harm seen in Europe. It is also a story in which a drug that was never legal reached 20,000 people through a gap in the rules, and the paperwork to find out who they were did not exist. That combination, real protection, and an unrecorded exposure running underneath it, is the shape of this entire history in miniature. In 1962, the United States Congress passed amendments to the Food and Drug Law, requiring manufacturers to prove effectiveness as well as safety before marketing, and tightening the investigational rules that Merrill had used. Kelsey received the President's Award for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service from President Kennedy that same year. The law changed because of what nearly happened. In the countries where it had already happened, nothing yet had changed at all. Chapter 20. The Slowest Withdrawal. Germany pulled the drug on the 27th of November, 1961. Britain followed within about a week. That was not the pattern everywhere. The withdrawal spread outward the way the drug had spread, unevenly, through separate national systems with separate information and separate commercial interests. There was no international mechanism to order a global recall, because no such mechanism existed. Sweden had sold the drug under the name Neurosedyn. Swedish families were among those affected, and Sweden's later handling of compensation became a reference point for other countries, partly because the Swedish injured organized early and effectively. Japan is the difficult case. Thalidomide had been marketed in Japan under several names, the best known being Isomin, produced under license by a domestic manufacturer. The news from Germany reached Japan quickly enough. It was reported. It did not translate into action. Sales in Japan were not suspended until the spring of 1962, and the recall was not completed until that September. Roughly 10 months separated the German withdrawal from the Japanese one. 10 months is not an administrative rounding error. The drug's damage occurs in a window of a few weeks in early pregnancy. 10 months of continued sale in a country of 90 million people is a measurable number of additional children, and the Japanese survivor population reflects it. Canada was also slow, keeping the drug available into 1962. Why the delays happened is not a single answer. In some places, the reports were treated as a foreign problem, requiring local confirmation. In some places, a licensee had inventory and a business to protect. In some places, the regulatory authority had no power to order a recall and had to negotiate one. All of those are explanations. None of them is a defense to a parent whose child was injured in month 8 of a 10-month delay. There is a general principle sitting inside this, and it is one of the few in this history that transferred cleanly into modern practice. The speed at which a safety signal travels across borders is not a technical detail. It is measured in children. Every country that now participates in international pharmacovigilance reporting does so because of the months that were lost in the winter of 1961 and the spring of 1962. That system exists. It was built out of this, which is another way of saying that the families in Japan and Canada paid for a lesson the rest of the world now benefits from, and were never described that way by anybody in authority. Chapter 21. The question put to the mothers. Every legal system in this story placed the same requirement on the same people: To recover anything, a family had to prove that this specific mother took this specific drug during this specific window of this specific pregnancy. Consider what that demand actually involved. A woman is asked, 8 or 10 years after the fact, to establish the date on which she swallowed a tablet. Not the month. The window that matters is a few weeks long, and the difference between 1 week and another can determine whether a claim succeeds. She has no prescription, because in Germany the drug was sold over the counter for 4 years, and because everywhere it was handed out as free samples. She has no pharmacy record. Her doctor may have made no note, or may have retired, or may have died, or may have destroyed old files as a matter of routine. She may not have taken it herself from a package with a name on it. She may have taken 2 tablets from a bottle in her mother's kitchen. Against this, the company's lawyers had every advantage. They had the documents. They had experts. They had time, and time cost them almost nothing while it cost the families everything. The imbalance was not accidental in the sense that someone designed it. It was structural. Civil litigation puts the burden of proof on the person bringing the claim, and the person bringing the claim was a parent with a damaged child and an ordinary income. There is a particular cruelty in the position it created, and it is worth naming because it explains behavior that otherwise looks strange. A mother pursuing a claim had to state, in a formal document, that she had taken a drug which had injured her child. That is a true statement. It is also a sentence that many women could not say without it landing as an admission of fault. Nothing in the process distinguished between causing harm and being deceived into causing harm. The legal question was simply what she took and when. Support groups formed in several countries around exactly this problem. Parents compared notes, helped each other reconstruct dates, and pooled information about which brands had been sold where and in what period. Much of the practical evidence in the British and German claims was assembled by parents doing detective work on their own histories. Institutions gathered the file about the company. The families had to gather the file about themselves. And they did it against a clock, because the argument they were preparing for was about to change shape entirely. Chapter 22. What was already settled. By the middle of 1962, the scientific argument was effectively over. Studies in several countries had confirmed the link. The pattern of injury matched the timing of exposure with a precision that left very little room for an alternative explanation. Researchers were able to state which days of a pregnancy produced which pattern of damage, which is not something you can do with a coincidence. Grunenthal itself stopped contesting the basic connection. The company's later position, maintained through the trial and afterward, was not that thalidomide was harmless. It was that the harm could not reasonably have been foreseen. That distinction is the entire remainder of this story, and it is worth stopping on, because most accounts move past it in a sentence. Once everyone agrees the drug caused the injuries, the fight is no longer about medicine. It becomes a fight about knowledge and timing, not what happened, but who understood what, on which date, and what they were obliged to do about it. And a fight of that kind is not settled in a laboratory. It is settled by reading documents, letters, internal memoranda, sales instructions, reports from company representatives, minutes of meetings, which means that from 1962 onward, the question that mattered to every injured family was not a medical question at all. It was whether anyone would be permitted to read the file. That is the reframe this account has been building toward, and everything that follows sits underneath it. 2 separate institutions assembled that file. A German criminal court spent 2.5 years compiling it. A British newspaper spent years reconstructing it independently. Neither of them delivered it to the public. The court stopped before it reached a finding. The newspaper was ordered by a judge not to print what it had found. This is not a claim that the material was destroyed or hidden in a vault. Much of it survives, and historians have worked with it since. The claim is narrower, and in some ways, stranger. The two institutions built specifically to establish facts and tell the public about them both arrived at the threshold, and both stopped. The families lived on the other side of that threshold for the rest of their lives. Chapter 23. The Indictment. It took more than 6 years from the withdrawal of the drug to the filing of charges. Prosecutors in Aachen worked through an enormous volume of material: company records, correspondence with doctors, sales documentation, medical evidence from hundreds of affected families. The scale of the investigation was without real precedent in German criminal practice. On the 18th of January, 1968, the state prosecutor filed an indictment against 9 men connected to Chemie Grunenthal. The charges centered on negligent homicide and the negligent infliction of bodily harm, together with offenses under the drug legislation of the period. Heinrich Müchter, the head of research, was among the accused. The theory of the prosecution was not that the company had set out to hurt anyone. Nobody suggested that. The theory was that the company had made safety claims it had no basis for, had received warnings it failed to act on, and had continued selling after the point at which a responsible manufacturer would have stopped. In other words, the prosecution had to prove foreseeability. It had to establish that a reasonable person inside that company, holding the information the company held, should have understood the risk in time to prevent the harm. That is a demanding standard, and the defense understood exactly how demanding it was. Their answer was straightforward. In the mid-1950s, nobody anywhere was screening medicines for harm to a developing embryo. The scientific assumption of the era held that the placenta protected the child. If the entire profession believed that, how could one company be criminally liable for believing it too? It is a strong argument. It is not a dishonest one, and it has a weakness that the prosecution pressed on repeatedly. A company that shares the general ignorance of its era is in one position. A company that prints a specific guarantee of complete safety in pregnancy, while sharing that general ignorance, has moved somewhere else. It has converted an assumption into a promise, and it has done so for commercial advantage. The indictment ran to enormous length. The evidence assembled behind it was larger still, and all of it had to be aimed at people, because in German criminal law there was nothing else it could be aimed at. Chapter 24. 9 men. The indictment named 9 individuals. They were not chosen at random. They were the people whose functions had touched the decisions in question: the owner side of a family-controlled business, the head of research, those responsible for the company's medical department, for its scientific communication, for what its representatives were told to say. Heinrich Müchter, the research chief hired in 1946, was among them. Naming 9 people was the prosecution's answer to a problem that had no good answer, and understanding that problem is the key to the entire outcome. German criminal law, then and now, punishes persons, not companies. A corporation cannot be sent to prison, and in the German system of that era, it could not be convicted of a crime at all. If the state wished to prosecute what a company had done, it had to find individuals and prove what each of them personally did wrong. So the prosecutors had to break a corporate history into 9 separate stories of individual fault. Now consider how the underlying conduct was actually distributed. Someone in research decided which tests to run. Someone in marketing wrote copy. Someone in the medical department drafted a reply to a doctor's letter. Someone in management approved a budget. Someone in sales briefed the representatives. Someone else signed off on the package insert revision. Not one of those acts, taken alone, is obviously criminal. Each is a normal task performed by a person doing their job within the assumptions of their industry. The harm was produced by all of them together, over 4 years, and the harm was enormous. This is the individualization problem, and it is not unique to this case. It appears wherever a large organization causes serious harm through the accumulation of ordinary decisions. Prosecutors have struggled with it in industrial disasters, in financial collapses, in environmental cases, in every jurisdiction that requires personal fault. The defense understood it perfectly and built its strategy on it. Their argument was never that the company had behaved well. It was that no individual defendant could be shown to have personally known enough, early enough, and to have held sufficient authority to have prevented what happened. Each man could point to the others. The research chief was not responsible for advertising. The marketing side relied on what research told them. Management relied on the professionals below them. None of those defenses is absurd. Together they form a structure with no center, and a criminal court, obliged to convict a named person of a named act beyond reasonable doubt, has nowhere to put its finding. Chapter 25. Not a Courtroom. The trial opened on the 27th of May, 1968. It did not open in Aachen. The regional court had no room capable of holding the proceedings, and so the trial was moved to Alsdorf, a mining town a short distance away, into a hall adapted for the purpose. Consider what that adaptation had to accommodate. 9 defendants, each with counsel, a bench of judges, the prosecution team, representatives of hundreds of injured families, who under German procedure were entitled to participate as joint plaintiffs, expert witnesses, and a press corps from across Europe, a hall built for something else, filled with folding chairs and microphone cables, hosting the largest criminal proceeding in the history of the Federal Republic to that date. There is something almost too neat in the image, and it should not be overworked, but it does say something real about the encounter between an industrial catastrophe and a legal system built for ordinary crimes. The machinery of German criminal law was designed to determine whether a particular person did a particular thing on a particular day. It was not designed to determine whether a corporation's internal culture of reassurance had, over 4 years and across dozens of decisions by dozens of employees, amounted to criminal negligence. The building did not fit, neither, it would turn out, did the law. The families who traveled to Alsdorf were not there for a philosophical point about legal design. They were there because this was the only place in the world where the question of responsibility was being asked out loud. Many of them attended for years. Chapter 26. 283 days. The trial sat for 283 days of hearings. That number is worth translating. Spread across 2.5 years, it means the court was in session, on this single case, for the equivalent of more than a working year. The volume of what went into the record in that time is difficult to summarize, and any summary risks flattening it, but the shape can be described. The prosecution built its case on documents. Correspondence between doctors and the company about nerve damage, internal discussion of how to respond to those reports, instructions to sales representatives, the advertising copy itself, and the question of what evidence stood behind each claim in it. The defense built its case on experts. This was the strategic core of the trial, and it is where the proceedings began to come apart. If the question is whether harm was foreseeable, then the answer depends on what the science of the period could support. And the science of the period was a matter of expert opinion. So the court heard experts. Then it heard experts contradicting those experts. Then it heard experts on the reliability of the methods used by the first experts. Epidemiology in 1968 was a younger discipline than it is now, and its standards of proof were genuinely contested. A defense that attacks the reliability of statistical inference is not automatically acting in bad faith. Some of those arguments were legitimate. The cumulative effect, however, was to convert a question about corporate conduct into an unresolvable seminar on scientific method. Every additional expert extended the proceedings. Every extension increased the cost, the strain on the families, and the pressure towards some resolution other than a verdict. And one of the people the defense worked hardest to discredit was the doctor who had identified the problem in the first place. Chapter 27. The witness Widukind Lenz had warned the company in November 1961. 7 years later, he was in a hall in Alsdorf, having his professional judgment taken apart in public. The defense strategy toward Lenz was not to deny that he had raised the alarm. That was on the record and could not be denied. The strategy was to argue that his method had been unsound, and therefore that the alarm he raised had not been the kind of warning a company was obliged to act on immediately. The attack focused on the interviews with mothers. Lenz had asked women what medication they had taken during early pregnancy. Some had not recalled thalidomide at first, and had recalled it on further questioning. That is a real methodological vulnerability, and any competent defense would press it. Memory is suggestible. A mother searching for an explanation for her child's injury may reach for one that has been offered to her. Lenz had considered the objection himself and had built his conclusion on more than the interviews, including the geographic and temporal distribution of the cases. But in a courtroom, the nuance of an epidemiologist's reasoning does not survive contact with focused cross-examination. The proceedings went further than a critique of method. Attempts were made to have him treated as a partisan rather than an expert, on the grounds that he had already reached a public conclusion. There is a bleak logic to it. The person best placed to explain the evidence was the person who had found it, and finding it was used as the reason to discount him. Lenz continued to work on thalidomide for the rest of his career. He built the most detailed record anyone has of which exposures produced which injuries, and that work remains the foundation of what is understood about the drug today. He was, by any ordinary reading of the events, the person who stopped it. In the room where responsibility was being determined, he spent his time defending himself. Chapter 28. The Standard of Care. Everything the court had to decide came down to a single measurement. What was a pharmaceutical manufacturer in the 1950s actually required to do? The answer, in West Germany at the time, was startlingly little. A manufacturer did not have to demonstrate that a medicine worked. It did not have to submit safety data to a national authority for evaluation. Nothing resembling a modern approval process stood between a compound and a pharmacy shelf. A company that wished to market a drug could largely do so. The legislation governing medicines in the Federal Republic in that period was concerned mainly with registration and with the conduct of pharmacies. It was not a system for evaluating whether a compound was fit to be given to human beings. That job was left to the manufacturer, so the defense could stand in front of the court and say, accurately, that Grunenthal had broken no rule about testing, because there was no rule about testing. Against that, the prosecution had to argue that a duty existed independently of the statute, that a manufacturer selling a substance to the general public carries an obligation of care that does not require a law to create it, and that this obligation is heavier, not lighter, when the law is silent. That is a serious legal argument, and it is one courts accept in many contexts. It is also much harder to convert into criminal liability for a named individual than a breached regulation would be. Here the experts came in again, and here the case became genuinely unresolvable. To establish the standard of care, the court needed to know what a reasonable company would have done in 1955. To know that, it heard from scientists about the state of the field in that decade. And the state of the field was contested, because how much a profession knows at a given moment is not something you can look up. Every witness who said a reasonable manufacturer should have tested for effects on the unborn was met by a witness who said no manufacturer anywhere was doing so. Both were describing something true. The first was describing what should have happened. The second was describing what did happen. Criminal liability attaches to the second. The German legislature drew its own conclusion from the case, and it did not wait for a verdict that never came. A new Medicines Act followed in the 1970s, establishing a proper approval regime with requirements for evidence of safety and efficacy before a product could be sold. The regulatory vacuum the defense had relied on was filled, which produced the closing irony of the German half of this story. The absence of any legal standard was the strongest argument for acquitting the men in the hall at Alsdorf. It was also the clearest possible proof that something had gone badly wrong and had to be fixed. The same fact did both jobs. It protected the accused, and it condemned the system that had made the accusation necessary. Chapter 29. The Families in the Hall. German criminal procedure allows an injured party to join a prosecution, not as a witness called and dismissed, but as a participant with standing, represented by counsel, present throughout. Hundreds of families exercise that right at Alsdorf. It meant that the hall was not simply a legal venue. It contained, for 2.5 years, the people the case was about. Try to hold the practical reality of that. A parent who wanted to follow the proceedings had to travel to a mining town, repeatedly, over years, arranging care for a child with substantial needs in order to sit in a converted room and listen to experts disagree about statistical method. Some attended constantly. Some came for the days that mattered to them and read reports of the rest. Some gave up. The families were present for the parts of the trial that were about them in name only. They heard their children discussed as case numbers in a pattern analysis. They heard the reliability of their own memories challenged. They heard scientists retained by the defense explain why the evidence connecting their children's injuries to the drug was less certain than it appeared. They also heard something they had never heard anywhere else, and this is the part that matters for understanding why the ending hurt so much. They heard the documents read out, the letters, the internal discussions, the instructions to the sales force. For the first time, in public, in an official setting, the material that described what the company had done was being put on a record by an officer of the state. For years, these parents had been told, in effect, that their belief about what had happened to their children was a private conviction. In that hall, it stopped being private. It became evidence, spoken aloud, entered formally, and reported by the press of a dozen countries. That is what a trial does, even before it reaches a verdict. It converts a grievance into a record, which is exactly why the manner of the ending landed the way it did. The families had not merely lost a chance at punishment. They had watched an official record being built, day after day, for 283 days, and then watched the institution building it decline to say what the record meant. The file was assembled and then set down. By the spring of 1970, the families sitting in that hall were being asked to make a decision of their own. Chapter 30. The 10th of April. By 1970, the trial had been running for nearly 2 years, with no end in sight, and the families were running out of time. Their children needed care now. Some needed surgery. Some needed housing that could be adapted. The parents were paying for all of it out of ordinary incomes. And the criminal trial produced no money at all, because a criminal court in Germany was not the body that would award them compensation. They were watching a process that might vindicate them eventually, and could not feed anyone in the meantime. On the 10th of April, 1970, a settlement was reached. Grunenthal agreed to pay 100 million German marks into a foundation established for the affected children. The West German federal government subsequently contributed a substantially larger sum, in the region of 320 million marks, and the Contergan Foundation was created to administer support for life. Take the arithmetic seriously for a moment. The manufacturer paid roughly a quarter of the initial fund. The taxpayers of the country paid the rest. Whatever the moral accounting of that arrangement, the financial accounting is not in dispute. The settlement was, for the families, a real improvement on nothing. It was also a decision taken under conditions that made refusing it very hard. And it had an effect on the criminal case that everyone involved understood at the time. Once the injured parties had accepted compensation, the argument that the public interest required a full criminal verdict lost a great deal of its force. The most damaged people had been provided for. The proceedings had already consumed enormous resources. The road to what happened in December was open. Chapter 31. Minor at best. On the 18th of December, 1970, the court discontinued the proceedings. The legal instrument was a provision of the German Code of Criminal Procedure permitting a court to end a case where the defendant's guilt, if established, would be regarded as minor and where there is no public interest in continuing. The court's reasoning, in substance, was that after 283 days, it could not establish individual criminal responsibility to the standard required, that any guilt which might be shown would be slight, and that the compensation arrangement had addressed the public interest. No one was convicted, no one was acquitted. Those two sentences are not the same, and the difference is the reason this case still matters. An acquittal is a finding. It says the state examined the accusation and could not prove it, and the accused walks out with that behind them. It is an answer. A discontinuance is the absence of an answer. The question was asked, at enormous length and expense, and then formally set down unfinished. For the defendants, that was an excellent outcome. They faced no penalty and no criminal finding, and they were never tried again. For the families, it was something harder to name. They had not lost. Losing would at least have been a conclusion. They had been told the machine could not process what had happened to them. There is a defense of the court's decision, and it should be stated because it is not frivolous. Criminal law requires proof of individual fault beyond reasonable doubt. Spreading a decision across a corporation over years among people who each did something small makes that standard genuinely difficult to meet. A court that convicts anyway, because the outcome was terrible and someone should answer, has abandoned the principle that protects everyone. That defense is coherent. It is also an admission with implications nobody in 1970 wanted to state plainly. If the law as constructed could not reach conduct of this kind, then the law as constructed did not deter conduct of this kind either. And the only remaining place where the full record might be laid out and examined in public was no longer a German courtroom. In Britain, the families had never had a criminal court at all. Chapter 32. The Foundation. The German settlement did not produce payments to individuals. It produced an institution. Legislation passed in the early 1970s established a foundation to administer support for the affected children, funded by the company's 100 million marks and the considerably larger federal contribution. It assessed each claimant, graded the severity of injury, and paid a monthly amount accordingly. For a state to legislate a compensation body in response to a private company's product was unusual. It was also, in practical terms, an admission that the ordinary machinery had failed. Courts had not resolved this. Parliament had to build something to do the job instead. The amounts were the problem. Monthly payments at the outset were graded across a range, and at the lower end, they were small enough to function as a supplement to a household income rather than a substitute for one. A person with the most severe injuries received more, but not an amount calculated on the assumption that they would need paid assistance for a full adult lifetime. Two errors were built into the arithmetic, and neither was malicious. The first was life expectancy. Planners in 1970 did not assume this group would live into their 60s and 70s. Medical opinion at the time was pessimistic about long-term outcomes, and the fund was scaled accordingly. The second was the pattern of need over time. It was assumed, reasonably enough, that the greatest costs would fall in childhood, during surgery and schooling, and the fitting of prosthetics. In fact, the opposite happened. Bodies that had spent 40 years compensating for missing structure began to fail in the compensating parts. A shoulder joint used for 4 decades to do the work of a hip does not last. Spines carrying asymmetric loads since infancy degenerate early. People who had managed independently for most of their adult lives began, in their 50s, to require the help they had been told they would need as children. The costs arrived when the fund was at its thinnest, and the recipients were least able to campaign. Adjustments followed, decades late. Grunenthal made a further payment of 50 million euros in 2008. German legislation raised the level of the pensions, and the annual sums attached to the scheme increased substantially from what had been set in the 1970s. Around 2,400 people were still receiving support through the German scheme in the middle of the last decade. There is a way of describing this that is entirely positive. A country recognized a harm, built a permanent institution to address it, and improved that institution when its original assumptions proved wrong. Not many places have done as much. There is another way of describing it that is equally true. The fund existed because a criminal trial ended without deciding anything, and the sum that started it was fixed by a negotiation conducted while the defendant still faced charges. Everything after that was correction. The people receiving those payments were compensated. They were never told, by anybody with the authority to say it, that they had been wronged. Chapter 33. Why it took 10 years. The British family's case moved slowly, for reasons that had nothing to do with the strength of their evidence. Start with the law of limitation. English law required a personal injury claim to be brought within a fixed period, and for a child that period generally ran from the age of majority, which helped, but the parents' own claims and the practicalities of assembling a case did not wait. More important was the way negligence had to be proved. The families could not simply show that the drug had injured their children. Causation was necessary, but not sufficient. They had to show that distillers had fallen below the standard of care reasonably expected of a pharmaceutical manufacturer in the late 1950s. That is the same foreseeability problem the German prosecutors faced, transplanted into a civil court with a lower standard of proof, but a defendant with far greater resources. And the standard of care of the industry in the 1950s was, as the previous chapters have shown, low. A company arguing that it had done what its competitors did was arguing from a strong position, because it was largely true. Then add cost. Litigation against a company of that size required expert evidence in pharmacology, embryology, and epidemiology gathered internationally. Legal aid existed in Britain, and many families used it. But a legally aided claimant who loses can still face consequences, and the prospect of years of proceedings against a well-funded opponent is its own deterrent. Then add the fact that the defendant had no reason to hurry. This is the point that gets lost. Delay in litigation is not neutral. It is a resource, and it belongs almost entirely to the party with money. Every year that passed made the families poorer, more exhausted, and more likely to accept whatever was on the table. Every year that passed cost distillers the fees of a legal department it maintained anyway. A stalled case is not a stalemate. It is a slow win for whoever can wait. Add to that the sub judice conventions and the contempt rules, which meant that while the case remained technically live, the press was constrained in what it could say about it. Put those together and you get a machine with a particular property. The longer the case remained unresolved, the harder it became to resolve, and the fewer outside forces could reach it. 10 years is not a delay in that machine. 10 years is the machine working. Chapter 34. 40%. The first substantial settlement came in 1968. 62 families reached an agreement with the company under which they would receive an amount equivalent to roughly 40% of the damages that would ordinarily be assessed for injuries of that kind. 40%. Not because their children were 40% injured, but because the litigation risk was priced into the deal. The family's lawyers had a real problem. To win in court, they would have had to prove negligence under English law as it stood, and the company would run the same foreseeability argument being run in Germany. If the families lost, they would receive nothing and could face ruinous costs. A guaranteed fraction was, in cold terms, a rational decision. Then came the condition, and this is the piece of the arrangement that shaped the next 5 years. The settlement was structured so that it took effect only if all the claimant families agreed. A holdout did not merely forfeit their own share. A holdout blocked the payment to everybody. Whatever the drafting intent, the practical effect was to convert the negotiation into something else entirely. A parent who believed the offer was too low was no longer arguing with a company. They were standing between other families and the money those families desperately needed. Pressure of that kind does not come from the company. It comes from the other parents, in letters and phone calls and meetings, from people in the same situation who cannot wait. By the early 1970s, there were several hundred further claims outstanding. The figure given in the House of Commons in November 1972 was 432 affected children in Britain, with 370 of them still without a settlement. Against that, distillers made an offer of £3.25 million, and one father read the terms and said no. Chapter 35. The Father Who Would Not Sign. David Mason was an art dealer in London. His daughter Louise had been born in 1962 with injuries caused by thalidomide. When the settlement proposal came to him, he examined the figure, compared it with what he understood a lifetime of care would cost, and refused. Accounts of how many other families held out differ. Some records describe Mason as the only parent who refused outright. Others describe a small group of families, around half a dozen, who would not sign. What is not in dispute is that Mason became the public face of the refusal, and that he sustained it when it would have been far easier to stop. The response was severe because the money for every family was blocked. Other parents turned on him. He was described as selfish, as gambling with other children's futures, as a man whose stubbornness was hurting people who had already suffered enough. Then the pressure moved from the personal into the legal. Steps were taken in the litigation to displace his authority, to decide on his daughter's behalf, on the argument that a father refusing a settlement was not acting in his child's best interests. Read that structure carefully, because it is the sharpest thing in this entire history. A father who thought the compensation for his daughter's injury was inadequate was met with a legal move to remove his standing to make decisions for her. The mechanism intended to protect a child from a bad parent was pointed at a parent for holding out for more. Mason challenged it, and he won. Part of what helped him was evidence from abroad. An award in the United States, in a Los Angeles case, had produced a settlement figure for a single injured child of around $2.7 million. Set beside a British proposal of £3.25 million for hundreds of children, the comparison was difficult to explain away. He also did something the other families had not done. He went to the press. He took the whole story, the offer, the condition, the attempt to remove him, and the arithmetic, to a newspaper that had already been circling the case for years. The editor of that newspaper was Harold Evans, and what he did with it produced the second great suppression in this history. Chapter 36. A Cause for National Shame. The Sunday Times had been working the thalidomide story for some time before David Mason walked in with his documents. What he brought was the thing the paper had been missing, which was a way in that the lawyers could not immediately close. On the 24th of September 1972, the paper published an article under the heading, "Our Thalidomide Children, A Cause for National Shame." It set out the situation in plain terms. Children injured a decade earlier, families still without settlement, an offer the paper described as grotesquely out of proportion to the injuries suffered, a company with very large profits taking a very long time. The article made a moral argument rather than a legal one. It did not accuse distillers of a crime. It said that a wealthy company was behaving shabbily toward damaged children and that the country should be ashamed of allowing it. That distinction was deliberate, and Harold Evans and his lawyers had thought carefully about it. The paper also announced what was coming next. A second article, already researched, would examine how the drug had come to be sold in Britain in the first place, what tests had been done, what distillers had known and when. That second piece was the real work. It was the reconstruction of the record, assembled by reporters from documents over years. And it was the article that never ran. The response to the first piece was immediate and large. Members of Parliament raised it. Readers wrote in. The pressure on distillers became public in a way it had not been through 10 years of quiet litigation. Within weeks, the Attorney General went to court. Chapter 37. The 17th of November. On the 17th of November, 1972, the Divisional Court of the Queen's Bench granted an injunction restraining the Sunday Times from publishing its second article. The legal basis was contempt of court. The reasoning ran as follows. Litigation between the families and distillers was still active. An article examining whether distillers had been negligent would be discussing the central question in a live case. Publishing it risked prejudicing those proceedings and applying improper pressure on a party to settle. That is the doctrine, and it is not absurd. Its purpose is to keep trials in courtrooms rather than in newspapers, and to protect defendants from being convicted by public opinion before a judge has heard anything. Applied here, it produced a result that is difficult to look at directly. The litigation had been running for 10 years. It was not close to trial. It was, in practice, a negotiation. And the negotiation was stalled precisely because one side had no incentive to move. So the rule designed to protect the integrity of a trial was used to prevent public discussion of a case that was not going to trial, in a way that removed the only pressure capable of shifting it. The newspaper had the evidence. The newspaper was ordered not to print the evidence, and the reason given was that printing it might affect proceedings which had already consumed a decade without producing anything. The Sunday Times challenged the order. In February 1973, the Court of Appeal, with Lord Denning presiding, discharged the injunction and allowed publication. The Attorney General appealed to the House of Lords. In the summer of 1973, the Lords reversed the Court of Appeal and restored the ban. Their reasoning was that an absolute rule was required, whatever its result in a particular case, to prevent what Lord Cross called a gradual slide towards trial by newspaper or television. The principle was preserved. The article stayed unpublished. Chapter 38, In the House. There was one place in Britain where the story could still be told out loud, and that was Parliament, because parliamentary privilege sits outside the reach of a contempt order. On the 29th of November 1972, Jack Ashley, the member for Stoke on Trent South, opened a Commons debate on the thalidomide children. Ashley had lost his own hearing some years earlier and had built his political life around disability. He was not a neutral participant and did not pretend to be. The Hansard record of that afternoon is one of the strongest documents in this entire history, because it contains, on the public record and beyond the reach of the injunction, the things the newspaper had been forbidden to print. Ashley put the company's finances into the record. Distillers, he said, held assets of £421 million and profits of £64 million, and had shown no compunction in fighting these children for no less than 10 years. He read the advertisement aloud. Distaval can be given with complete safety to pregnant women. He described the press situation without ambiguity. The problems of thalidomide children, he said, might have lain in a legal limbo forever had it not been for a series of articles in the Sunday Times which was both brave and brilliant, and then of the company's response that the Distillers Company tried to gale the editor of the Sunday Times for his pains. The figures he gave were 432 affected children in Britain, of whom 370 still had no settlement. The government's answer came from the Secretary of State for Social Services, Sir Keith Joseph, and it was a statement of powerlessness. Ministers, he said, cannot intervene in the litigation or the negotiations, any more than our predecessors were able to. 24 hours before the debate, the company had raised its offer from £3.25 million to £5 million. That timing tells you what was working. Nothing in the debate was new information. Every fact Ashley put on the record had been known to the litigants for years, and most of it had been known to the Sunday Times for months. What changed was the location. Facts that could not be printed in a newspaper could be spoken in the chamber, reported as parliamentary proceedings, and read the following morning by the entire country. The injunction had sealed one channel. It had no authority over the other. And once the material was in open circulation, the pressure found the place where a public company actually feels it. Chapter 39. The Owners. The injunction stopped the Sunday Times from printing the evidence about the drug. It did not stop the paper from printing something else. A public company has owners, and the identity of large shareholders is not a secret. It is a matter of public filing. The paper turned its attention to who actually owned distillers. The answer was not a handful of individuals. It was institutions, insurance companies, pension funds, The organizations that hold the retirement savings of ordinary working people invested in a portfolio of large British firms. Naming them changed the nature of the problem completely. An insurance company or a pension fund does not want to appear in a newspaper story about damaged children. Its business is the appearance of prudence and respectability. It has customers who can move their money, and it has managers who do not enjoy explaining a headline to a board. None of those institutions had done anything wrong. They had bought shares in a large drinks company. That was the point. They were now visibly attached to a decision they had not made and could not defend, and the only way out was to press the company to fix it. Simultaneously, the pressure crossed the Atlantic. Ralph Nader, then at the height of his influence in American consumer politics, took up the case and pushed for a boycott of distillers' products in the United States. That was the company's exposed flank. Its whiskey brands were substantial exporters, and the American market was worth far more to it than its pharmaceutical division had ever been. Follow the mechanism carefully, because it explains the outcome better than any moral argument. For 10 years, the cost of not settling was low. Legal fees, some unfavorable press, and a slow attrition of claimants who ran out of endurance. The cost of settling generously was immediate and large. Within a few months, that arithmetic inverted. The cost of not settling became a threat to the core business, to the share price, and to relationships with the institutions that owned the company. The offer moved from £3.25 million to £5 million, and then, in 1973, to £20 million. It is important to be exact about what caused that. It was not a court. No English court ever found distillers negligent. No judge ordered a penny of it. The money moved because a newspaper, prevented from publishing the evidence, published the ownership structure instead, and because a politician read the rest into the parliamentary record where no injunction could reach. The families won by going around the legal system rather than through it. That is a victory. It is also a description of a legal system that did not work. Chapter 40. The X list and the Y list. When the money finally arrived, it had to be divided, and dividing it required deciding who counted. The trust established to administer the British settlement had to determine which children were entitled to what. That meant medical assessment. Children were examined, their injuries described and graded, and the results used to calculate what each would receive across a lifetime. The classification produced two categories. Children whose injuries were accepted as thalidomide-related were placed on one list. Children whose cases were considered uncertain, where the pattern was less characteristic or the evidence of exposure weaker, were placed on another and received reduced amounts. The lists were referred to by letter: X for the confirmed, Y for the doubtful. There is a reason a system like that exists, and it is not malice. A fund is finite. Some conditions resembling thalidomide injury occur naturally, without any drug involved. A trust distributing a fixed sum has an obligation to the confirmed claimants not to dilute the fund with cases that cannot be substantiated. That reasoning is sound in the abstract. In practice, it meant that a family's entitlement depended on how well their child's body matched a pattern, and on how well a mother could evidence a tablet she had taken years earlier. The classification followed people into old age. It determined the scale of support available for equipment, for adapted housing, for care as they aged. A designation made in the early 1970s, on the evidence then available, set the terms of a person's practical existence into their 60s. Some of those assessments were later revisited as understanding improved. Lenz's calendar of harm made it possible to check an injury pattern against a claimed date of exposure with far more confidence than had been available at the outset. But revisiting a case requires knowing that revisiting is possible and requires the energy to pursue it, and the people best placed to pursue it were the people with the greatest care needs and the least spare capacity. Return, for a moment, to the sentence in the advertisement. Complete safety to pregnant women. The company that printed it required no evidence at all to make the claim. The children injured by it spent their lives being asked to prove things to a standard the manufacturer had never been held to. That asymmetry is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the documented structure of what happened, in Germany and in Britain, in the criminal courts and the civil ones, and the compensation schemes that followed both. Chapter 41. Strasbourg. The injunction outlived the settlement it had been protecting. Even after the families had accepted the £20 million, the order against the Sunday Times remained. The paper kept fighting it, and the ban was not finally lifted until 1976, at which point the article ran, 4 years after it had been written. By then, the Sunday Times had taken the case somewhere the British courts could not follow. The paper applied to the European Commission of Human Rights, arguing that the injunction had violated the right to freedom of expression guaranteed by the European Convention on Human Rights. On the 26th of April 1979, the European Court of Human Rights delivered its judgment in the case known as the Sunday Times against the United Kingdom. The court found that the United Kingdom had violated Article 10 of the Convention. The restriction on publication had not been necessary in a democratic society. The court's reasoning gave weight to the fact that the families and the public had a legitimate interest in the information, and that the litigation had been dormant for years. The decision was close. The judges divided narrowly, which is itself a fair indication that the underlying legal question was genuinely difficult rather than obviously wrong. The consequence in Britain was concrete. Parliament passed the Contempt of Court Act in 1981, which narrowed the doctrine considerably and made it much harder to restrain reporting on a case that was not actively before a jury. So the law changed. Again. That is the third time in this account that the answer to a catastrophe was a statute. American drug law after 1962. German compensation arrangements after 1970, British contempt law after 1981. Each of those changes was real, and each of them protects people today. Not one of them was a finding of responsibility for what had already happened. The pattern is consistent enough to be worth naming plainly. In every jurisdiction, the system proved able to reform itself and unable to hold anyone to account. Rules were rewritten. Nobody answered. Chapter 42. Still litigating in 2012. It would be reasonable to assume the legal story ended in the 1970s. It did not. In Australia, a woman named Lynette Rowe brought proceedings against Grünenthal and against the company that had distributed the drug in Australia. She had been born without arms or legs. In the last year, the drug was reaching Australian households. Her case had a specific difficulty. Some claimants can point to a prescription or a medical note. Rowe's evidence of exposure depended substantially on her mother's account and on the characteristic pattern of her injuries. 50 years after the drug was withdrawn, the same evidentiary problem described earlier in this account was still the central obstacle. In July of 2012, on the eve of trial, the case settled out of court. The terms of that individual settlement were confidential. A class action followed on behalf of others. In February of 2014, an Australian court approved a settlement of 89 million Australian dollars, covering more than 100 claimants. 2014. 52 years after the withdrawal. Two things are worth drawing out of this. The first is that the survivors' need for money was not a historical episode that was closed in 1973. Care costs rise as people age. Bodies that adapted around missing limbs deteriorate faster. Payments calculated in the 1970s on assumptions about life expectancy that turned out to be wrong ran short. The second is the pattern this account has followed from the beginning. Settled out of court, approved as a settlement, confidential terms, no finding. 50 years, 3 continents, and a criminal prosecution, and the record still contains no judicial determination that the manufacturer of thalidomide was responsible for what thalidomide did. There are apologies. There are foundations, trusts, statutory schemes, and very large sums of money. Governments in several countries have expressed regret, including the British government, which in 2010 made a formal statement of sincere regret to the survivors and their families. Regret is not a verdict either. What exists instead is an extraordinary volume of documentation, gathered by prosecutors and journalists and researchers and the families themselves, describing in detail what happened and how, and standing in permanent lieu of anyone official saying so. Chapter 43. The Ledger That Is Still Open. On the 31st of August, 2012, Grunenthal issued an apology. The company's chief executive spoke at the unveiling of a memorial in Stolberg, the town where the business had started in a former smelting works. The statement asked forgiveness for the fact that for nearly 50 years, the company had not found a way of reaching the affected from human being to human being. It asked that the long silence be understood as a sign of the shock their fate had caused. Survivors' organizations rejected it, and their objection was specific rather than emotional. The statement apologized for silence. It did not accept responsibility for the drug, for the safety claims made about it, or for the conduct of the litigation. 50 years of not speaking was described as shock. The years of contesting the evidence were not addressed at all. At the time of that apology, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people were living with thalidomide injuries worldwide. They are in their 60s now. Bodies that compensated for missing or shortened limbs across 6 decades are wearing out faster than the bodies around them. The shoulder that did the work of a hip, the spine that carried an asymmetric load since infancy. Care needs that were calculated in the 1970s were calculated wrong, because nobody then expected this group to live as long as they have. Now set beside that, the honest limits of what this record can establish. The true worldwide number of children affected is not known. Estimates run from around 10,000 upward, and the reason for the uncertainty is contained in the story itself. Free samples left no trace. 46 countries used dozens of brand names. Around 4 in 10 of the children did not survive infancy, in an era when a newborn death was often recorded without an inquiry into its cause. In the United States, the tablets distributed under the investigational program were never fully traced. 17 injured children were confirmed. Whether that is the complete figure cannot now be determined, because the records required to determine it were never made. What did Heinrich Möchter actually believe about his own product? Nobody can say. He was never asked in a court that reached a finding, and he died in 1987. That is the shape of the file. Enormous, detailed, and permanently incomplete at exactly the points where a company's obligations would have been decided. And the drug is still in use. Thalidomide turned out to be genuinely valuable for other conditions. It is used against a serious inflammatory complication of leprosy and in the treatment of a form of blood cancer. Under controlled conditions, it does real good. Brazil has a high burden of leprosy and manufactures thalidomide under government supervision. Researchers there have reported that around 4 million tablets a year are distributed through public health programs. A study published in 2011 examined births in Brazil across more than 2 decades and found cases with the thalidomide pattern occurring in children born long after 1965. The measured rate in the later period was higher than in the earlier one, not lower. The authors did not describe their findings as a historical curiosity. They described them as an alert toward the prevention of an announced tragedy. An announced tragedy, meaning a harm that is fully documented, entirely understood, and still happening, which returns this account to the question underneath all of it. The medical facts were settled by 1962. Everything after that was a series of institutions deciding how much of the record the public was entitled to see and how much responsibility anyone would be required to accept for it. A criminal court gathered the evidence for 2.5 years and then stopped. A newspaper gathered it independently and was ordered to keep it to itself for 4 more. The families were left holding a fact that nobody with authority would finish stating. David Mason won his fight. His daughter and hundreds of other children received the £20 million, and the trust that was set up to hold it is still paying out. Widukind Lenz was proved right and spent his career documenting exactly how right he had been. Francis Kelsey kept a signature off a piece of paper and was given a medal by a president. Every one of those is a genuine victory, and not one of them is a verdict. The last entry in this file is not in a courtroom or an archive. It is in a public health surveillance system in Brazil, where people count births month after month, watching for a pattern first described by a pediatrician in Hamburg in 1961. They are still counting, which means the record is not closed and was never going to be.